All right, everyone, this is part 2 of the history of evolutionary thought. We left off on the last recording with Charles Lyell. This was, I think, the last slide that was on that recording. So we are going to transition into talking about Charles Darwin now. So just to recap, we left off with Charles Lyell being a proponent of uniformitarianism. So he was a geologist, and uniformitarianism is the idea that the same gradual geological processes that we observe today were operating the same way in the past that they do today. So through this line of reasoning, Charles Lyell argued that the Earth has to be incredibly old because, using the example I talked about last time, if we look at something like the Grand Canyon, which is pictured on the slide, we can understand exactly what physical processes are happening to produce the Grand Canyon. We know that it is the motion of the Colorado River moving through the canyon, gradually eroding away the walls of that canyon, and eventually producing what we see today. So because that process is so gradual and so slow, we can infer that the Earth has to be incredibly old, definitely older than 6,000 years. So Charles Lyell was really influential in talking about the age of the Earth. Now, he had no idea how old the Earth actually was. That information was still, 60 or 70 years off. Attempts to figure that out with any kind of real scientific validity were quite far in the future. But he was able to say with a lot of certainty that 6,000 year number that we talked about before would be highly unlikely. I also talked about how Charles Lyell was a good friend of Darwin's. He was actually one of Darwin's teachers at Cambridge when Darwin was in college, attending the university. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin. We are firmly into the 19th century at this point. You can see a picture here of Charles Darwin. Those of you who have seen pictures of Charles Darwin before have probably seen the pictures of him as an older man with that kind of long grizzled beard, but this is what he looked like when he was a lot younger. Okay, so the theory of natural selection was actually formulated by two different people independently. One of them was Charles Darwin, and of course he gets most of the credit in modern times for that discovery. And the other was a man named Alfred Russel Wallace, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Both men had similar views on biology and nature. They had a lot of the same influences. They read a lot of the same materials during their training. And as I said, we'll get back to Wallace in a moment. So back to Darwin. Darwin came from a very well-to-do family with an intellectual background in England. He was the grandson of a gentleman named Erasmus Darwin, who was a physician and a member of a lot of important intellectual circles in England during his lifetime. Erasmus Darwin made a lot of valuable contributions. For example, he was the first to suggest that life first emerged from the sea, and that all species have a common ancestor at some point in the past. So Darwin's family was very much a part of the intellectual elite of England during this time period. Erasmus Darwin also wrote here and there about early concepts of evolution. So we know that Darwin was raised in an environment where he was familiar with his grandfather's writings, and there was an emphasis on intellectualism within his family. So as a young man, he went off to Cambridge, and he actually enrolled in medical school in training to become a physician. Darwin's father was very insistent that Darwin become a physician, and he actually hated it. All of the evidence in the form of his writings from the time indicate that he just had no stomach for learning anatomy. Learning anatomy in a lab setting is difficult even in modern times with preservatives and formaldehyde and stuff like that. In Darwin's time, it would have been really probably pretty monstrous to be working in an anatomy lab and trying to learn that way. So Darwin really had no interest in medicine, and he pushed back against his father quite a lot because his father was so kind of insistent on him becoming a physician. Eventually, Darwin was able to convince his father to let him abandon his medical studies, and he actually entered more of a religious studies track. But throughout all of this, Darwin always retained a very strong interest in the natural sciences. So he took the equivalent of a lot of elective courses in the natural sciences. He worked with a lot of the professors in the natural sciences, and he became well known in those circles, even though he technically wasn't a student in that field. Now, Darwin during this time period, as I said, was a student of Charles Lyell's, so he was pretty strongly influenced by Lyell's work with geology and uniformitarianism. He was also well aware of the debate within the scientific community on the subject of evolutionary change. Now, his writings during this time period don't indicate that he has a strong opinion in any direction about evolutionary theory or evolutionary processes. We know that he was aware of the debate, but he doesn't seem to have had any firm stances on the subject during this time period. Now, fast forward a little bit, Darwin graduates from Cambridge, and he is being pressured by his father to pursue a profession, basically. His father, as I think a lot of people can understand today, his father wanted him to kind of stop messing around and settle down and have a career. Darwin was still kind of hung up on natural studies. Because he had become so familiar with a lot of the intellectual elite in the naturalist community of England during his time at Cambridge, he was actually offered a position as basically the shipboard scientist, what we would today call a biologist, on the HMS Beagle. So we're going to talk about the HMS Beagle in just a moment. Darwin had a really difficult time convincing his father to allow him to go on this voyage. As again, I want to stress he didn't really have any firm ideas about evolutionary theory before the voyage. So he went on this voyage as kind of almost like a blank slate in terms of his opinions about evolution. He had a lot of background, as I said, with Lyell's ideas and whatnot, but he was eventually able to convince his father to let him go on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. This was a government-funded scientific voyage. So it was a 5-year scientific voyage that was funded by the British government. And you can see on the map on the slide the path of the voyage, basically all of the ports that the ship stopped in over the course of the 5 years. So when Darwin left on this voyage, he had a lot of traditional views about the fixity of species, but what he saw on the voyage really started to impact his mind and change his mind. So he saw an incredible amount of diversity across the globe. As we kind of mentioned on the last slide set, if you sail from port to port, every time you get off the ship and look around you, you're going to see some drastically different life forms than what you're used to. So if we, like, for instance, we have the stop at King George's Sound in Australia, and the next stop was in these islands here in the Indian Ocean, and then of course down to Cape Town. You're going to see really dramatically different flora and fauna in those places. So he was really kind of surprised and in awe of the amount of diversity that he saw both in animals and plants. Now, one of the things that was really influential during the voyage of the Beagle was when he stopped in South America. So they left England and then immediately started sailing around the coast of South America. Now, when he was in South America, he saw a lot of fossils from various sources in these ports. He was introduced to a lot of fossils, and what he saw really impacted him because he saw a lot of fossils of giant animals. The thing that he noticed about these giant animals is that they looked almost exactly like regular-sized living animals. Now, a classic example of this is the sloth. So we all know what a modern tree sloth looks like. It's kind of the size of maybe a medium-sized dog. They hang from the tree. They're entirely arboreal for the most part. Now, Darwin, among other things, saw fossils of extinct giant sloths. So the picture here on the left is an example of a giant sloth fossil in a museum. There's nothing there for scale, but these fossils can stand as high as about 20 feet in height. So these are gigantic animals. Now, with the exception of their size, if you just look at their skeletal features, they look exactly like a modern day sloth. They're just scaled up to a pretty extreme degree. So when Darwin saw all of these fossils, and he could also study the living versions of these animals in life that are much smaller, what he began to suspect is that the fossils represent ancestral forms of what exists today. So he began to speculate that the modern version here, this modern little tree sloth here, is descended from a much larger ancestor. So again, this is really important and something that was very influential for Darwin. Now, one of the places that is most commonly associated with Darwin are the Galapagos Islands. So if we go back to this map, the Galapagos Islands are off of the west coast of the country of Ecuador. So right here, they're a group of volcanic islands that are fairly close to shore. But there are just a ton of these islands. All of them are pretty close together. In some cases, if you're standing on the shore of one, you can easily see the shore of the next island. So it's this little cluster of semi-isolated oceanic islands. And what he noticed when he stopped in the Galapagos Islands is that, again, an incredible amount of diversity of things. And what he noticed in the Galapagos, one of the things he noticed is that we have these sets of animals that are found on the islands that are not found anywhere else. And some of them seem to be pretty closely related. He also noted that these islands tend to be missing whole groups of animals. So, for example, none of these islands have large mammals. And it makes it pretty distinct because the mainland, which is not too far off from the Galapagos Islands, has a full suite of large mammals. So what he was noticing was the unique selection of animals that these islands have. Now, what he also noticed is that each of these isolated islands seem to have slightly different sets of the same animals. So each island, Island A has large tortoises, finches, and iguanas. And Island B also has those three types of animals, but they're slightly different. So each of these islands have distinct versions of all of these animals, and they seem to all be pretty closely related. But he was speculating about why each of these islands would have a slightly different version of the same set of animals. Now, the concept of adaptive radiation is something that's going to come back up throughout the rest of the semester. All of what Darwin was observing, but especially what he was observing on the Galapagos, was seeding the idea of what would eventually be termed adaptive radiation. So a lot of what we know of Darwin's work in the Galapagos is specifically looking at birds. So types of finches that you can see on the screen here. So Darwin collected 13 specimens of these finches, these little birds. Each finch was from a different location or a different island, and all of them overall looked pretty similar. They all basically look like this in their bodies, but from each island, he found a slightly different version of this finch. Now, the primary difference from island to island is in beak shape. So we can see here different versions of finch beaks and what diet they correspond with. So he noticed, on Island A, the finches have a large beak and that they are eating seeds. On Island B, they have kind of a small narrow beak and that they're all eating grubs. So what he was noticing was that from island to island, these finches have slightly different beak morphology and different diets. So what he speculated is that these birds are all descended from a recent common ancestor, and that common ancestor is located on the mainland. So he believed basically that there's a version of this bird that lives on the mainland. At some point in history, at some point in time in the past, these birds arrived in the Galapagos Islands from the mainland and began to diversify. So they began to change and kind of develop these very specific characteristics depending on what kind of island they were on. So, as I said, this is a really important part of Darwin's theory. The definition I have here for adaptive radiation is pretty straightforward. The diversification of one founding species into multiple species and ecological niches. So again, what he's talking about here is the origins of diversity. Why do we see the amount of diversity in nature that we do? And what natural processes could possibly be leading to that? Okay, so Darwin, the voyage of the Beagle is 5 years. Darwin returned to England after that. Over the course of the 5 years, he had been collecting specimens from all over the world and shipping them back home. So when he arrived back from the voyage of the Beagle, he had just crates and crates, hundreds of crates of specimens to go through. So once he got back from England, he really settled into studying all of the materials that he had sent back. He also had very copious notes that he had taken the entire voyage. So he was going back through everything that he had learned, everything that he observed, all of the specimens that he had brought back. So when he got back, he starts considering all of these ideas, starts to think about the origin of diversity, and use all of the data that he had collected on his voyage to try to formulate a hypothesis or a theory, a hypothesis that would become a theory on where that diversity comes from. So what he eventually produced is his theory of evolution by natural selection. So the question is, we talked about adaptive radiation. How does the process of adaptive radiation occur? So we see this explosion in diversity, but why is it happening? What processes are underlying this adaptive radiation that are leading to the amount of diversity that we see? So we will talk more about his theory in just a moment, but he had, as I said, read a lot of different works from different scholars in the natural fields. He also had read a lot of Thomas Malthus's work. So Thomas Malthus was an economist, and he wrote an essay arguing that when food is plentiful and predators are scarce, animal populations are going to grow. So basically what Malthus is saying, is that populations have the potential for explosive growth. Now, Malthus also argues that population size is going to be limited by the resources available. So there's going to be a cap on the amount of growth that a population can have by the types of resources that are available. So we know that Darwin was influenced by this idea and that he read Malthus's work, and he kind of applied it to his own thought processes. So what he believed is that competition for resources is always going to be present in nature. Darwin also spent a lot of time studying what animal breeders do, specifically dog breeders and horse breeders, I believe it is. And he noted that the processes that are occurring during animal domestication and animal breeding are similar to what must be happening in nature. Now, what he was looking at, of course, was artificial selection, which we talked about in the beginnings, in the first slide set. Artificial selection is the process of domestication. So, selecting versions of animals that have traits that are desirable for whatever reason. And you can have some pretty distinct differences that occur within a species as a result of this type of selective breeding, this artificial selection. Classic example, like I have here on the slide, how is it that a mastiff, the size of the one on the slide, is the same species as a Chihuahua? Those two animals are genetically very, very similar, almost identical, and can technically, from a genetic standpoint, interbreed and produce viable offspring. So he was looking at processes like these with regards to artificial selection, and he was hypothesizing that something similar must be happening in nature. Now, we will come back to more detail about natural selection in just a moment, but before we get to that, I do want to hop over and talk about Alfred Russel Wallace for a second. So Alfred Russel Wallace is the other discoverer, the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection. I mentioned at the beginning of this slide set that Darwin was the co-discoverer. So Alfred Russel Wallace lived there was a pretty wide overlap in terms of when he and Darwin were alive. Alfred Russel Wallace was a field biologist. He had a lot of really important contributions to the field of biogeography, and to the extent that he is known as the father of biogeography. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace had a very different background from Darwin's. Darwin came from a rich family. He had extensive formal training in natural studies at Cambridge. He made a lot of good connections there. Wallace was from more of a blue-collar background. He was largely self-taught, and he was a working field biologist. So he didn't have family money. He didn't have a life of leisure. This was his profession. He traveled around the world working as a field biologist. Now, as a result, he observed a lot of the same things around the planet that Darwin did. In all of his travels, he was really speculating about a lot of the same things that Darwin was speculating about. Okay, so Darwin, we will come back to Alfred Russel Wallace in a little bit, but as I said, Darwin and Wallace are the co-discoverers of natural selection. So in the late 1830s, Darwin had returned from the voyage of the Beagle. He was kind of formulating all of his ideas about what he observed on the voyage. He started to home in on what would become his proposed mechanism for evolutionary change. So the general idea that he came up with, what he was kind of thinking about, is that favorable variations in nature are preserved and unfavorable variations will eventually be eliminated. So when we say favorable variations, some kind of physical trait maybe that is beneficial in a given environment is going to spread in that population, and something that is detrimental is going to be removed. So a little kind of timeline here for us. Again, late 1830s, Darwin has returned from the Beagle. He's starting to formulate his ideas. In 1844, he wrote his first summary of natural selection. He was still very hesitant about publishing it. Now, remember, I talked about on the first part of this lecture set that there was a lot of debate in the scientific community during the 19th century about evolutionary ideas. Cuvier, for example, was someone who was rabidly against ideas of evolutionary change. So Darwin he was really confident in his ideas, but he was also a very shy man, very quiet and reserved man, and he really didn't want to enter into such a kind of mean-spirited debate as he knew he would be the center of if he published his ideas. So he went about 15 years without publishing any of his work. He kept writing. He, spoke with friends and colleagues within the field, but he was very hesitant to publish anything official. Now, we jump ahead to 1855. Alfred Russel Wallace, this guy here, Alfred Russel Wallace actually had, as I said, been having some of the same thought processes as Darwin, and he decided to put them into words and publish them. And in 1855, Wallace published an article arguing that species today are descended from other species from the past, and that the emergence of new species is directly related to environmental change. So this is exactly what Darwin's idea was. This is exactly what Darwin's been working on for the last 20 years. It really lit a fire under Darwin. Darwin was freaked out himself. He was like, thinking his life's work was going to be pulled out from under him and someone else was going to get credit for it. All of his close friends and confidants, Lyell included, read Wallace's work and also freaked out, and they all kind of urged Darwin to publish as soon as possible. So, in 1858, Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript. Now, they didn't know each other personally, but by this point, Darwin had earned a bit of a reputation as a naturalist in the scientific community. Wallace was aware of Darwin's reputation and sent Darwin a manuscript with his own coherent theory of evolution by natural selection. So he had kind of fleshed out all of his ideas and he was ready to publish them. His ideas, again, were almost identical to Darwin's theory of natural selection. So Darwin, again, panicked and finally decided that he couldn't put it off any longer and he had to go ahead and publish his work. So Darwin wrote back to Wallace and said, I've been, thinking the same thing. Here are my ideas. Why don't we present our ideas together? So Darwin presented a pretty quickly written paper that was read at a scientific meeting in London at the same time as one of Wallace's papers presented at the same time. So they both presented jointly almost at this meeting. Nobody really reacted much to either of the papers. The following year, in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species. So you've probably heard of this book. It is the seminal work of Darwin's life for the most part. It is a very articulate and very carefully researched and supported presentation of his theory of natural selection. Now, we'll get to what exactly his theory entails in a moment, but it was exactly as bad as Darwin suspected. So remember, he had held off on publishing for a long time because he was afraid of the backlash. The backlash was really terrible for him. So because his book On the Origin of Species was so carefully researched and so thoroughly documented, the scientific community largely supported his work. They could see that it was a well-reasoned, well-documented, and well-researched piece of writing. So the scientific community wasn't really the issue. They all pretty much agreed with him, but public opinion was mostly negative, and a lot of it was led by religious authorities and fed by the media. Now, a lot of that media came in the form of cartoons, as you can see on the slide here, cartoons making fun of Darwin, with his characteristic long bearded head on the body of an ape. So he had a lot of detractors in the media and in the religious communities, but he was really trying to stay out of the spotlight for the most part. At this point, also, Darwin had a variety of health problems. There's speculation that he might have caught some kind of parasitic disease when he was on the voyage of the Beagle, because he had poor health throughout the rest of his life after he returned. So he may have had some kind of undiagnosed tropical disease or parasite that was left untreated for the rest of his life. At any rate, because Darwin was so shy and was so uninterested in public arguing, one of his friends named Thomas Huxley kind of took up the mantle of defending Darwin. So Thomas Huxley, pictured here, is sometimes referred to as Darwin's bulldog. This is because he was a really well-known and very outspoken defender of Darwin and his ideas. And whereas Darwin was always kind of at home, he was kind of a homebody, he wasn't interested in going out in public and debating his ideas, Thomas Huxley had the kind of personality where he was happy to be kind of belligerent in the public sphere. So he really took up the mantle of defending Darwin's ideas in public. Just as a side note, Thomas Huxley was a scientist in his own right. He did, as you can see here on the slide, he did pretty extensive studies of ape anatomy. He was kind of into studying ape anatomy. This is one of his original diagrams from one of his works. He also, just as a side note, coined the term agnostic to describe his own religious views. You've probably heard the term agnostic before, but if not, it just means that you are neither religious nor atheist. You're kind of just unsure about the existence of a deity. Also, he was ancestor to Aldous Huxley, who would later write Brave New World. Okay, so let's talk about Darwin and Wallace's theory. What did they present at that scientific conference that they presented at together? So basically their work can be broken down into 2 points. First, life on Earth arose by evolution. Darwin originally used the term descent with modification. And number 2, the mechanism of evolution is natural selection. Something that's important to remember here is that natural selection doesn't have any goals. It's simply a response to the current environment. So the environment is what's driving evolution. Everything is a reaction to what's happening in the environment. So Darwin and Wallace's theories, again, were very similar when we break it down into the essentials. Now, when Darwin published on the origin of species, he went into extensive explanations about his reasoning behind his theory. So we'll actually go through his line of reasoning here. So his line of reasoning is comprised by 3 observations and 2 deductions. The first observation listed here is that all organisms have the potential for explosive population growth that would outstrip their food supply. So this observation is really going back to Thomas Malthus's work. We talked about him before. He was the economist who talked about the potential for explosive population growth. So he's just acknowledging Darwin here and is saying that every species, every population can potentially have an explosive population growth. We all have the potential. His second observation is that in nature, populations are roughly stable. So one thing I like to bring up when I'm talking about this, especially with regards to observation 1, is if we look at what's happening with the human population in modern times. The human population is up to, 8 billion, something like that. And it's because we don't have the limitations on our food supply that our ancestors had. We're able to produce our own food. We're able to grow our own food. So we really don't have the limitations on our population size that our species has had in the past. So this is an example of an organism having the potential for explosive population growth. So again, observation 2, in nature, populations are roughly stable. So with the exception of humans, because again, we have kind of modified our environment to allow for explosive population growth, in nature, populations of deer, for example, are roughly stable. So if we take these 2 observations, we can deduce from them that there has to be a struggle for existence. If there's limitations to resources, there's going to be a struggle for access to those resources. Okay, observation 3, nature is full of variation. Deduction 2, so the deduction following that observation. Therefore, some of these variations must be favored and others disfavored in a process called natural selection. So what this just means in a nutshell is that we have these populations that have the potential for explosive population growth. They aren't explosively growing for whatever reason, so we have to assume that there's some kind of struggle. Now, nature is full of variations. Variation in size, variation in hunting ability, variation in vision, etc., etc. Some of those individuals are going to do well in a given environment, and some of them are not going to do well. And that's all natural selection is. It just means that some individuals in a population are better suited to succeeding in that population than others. So natural selection is actually a very simple process. It's very logical. We can see these processes happening in nature. They're very easy to understand intuitively. Okay, so I want to take a brief moment to talk about, to go over some important terms. These are terms that we'll probably be using for the rest of the semester, so it's important for you to understand them. The first is reproductive success. So reproductive success is the number of offspring that an individual produces that live to reproductive age. So it's not just the raw number of offspring. Those offspring in and of themselves have to be healthy and successful enough to live to reproductive age. So reproductive success is somewhat related to the next term, which is fitness. Fitness is an individual's reproductive success relative to other members of the same species. So we have like a comparison aspect here. So as a human, my reproductive success as a human woman would be the number of offspring that I have that 20 years down the road are still doing well and are healthy. Now, fitness takes it a little bit further. Fitness would be more of a comparison between how many children I have versus how many children my neighbor has. So if we have an example, let's say in my own family, I have a brother who has 4 children. I do not have any children. So my brother currently has better reproductive success and better reproductive fitness. So if we compare my reproductive success to my brother's reproductive success, he is much more fit, reproductively speaking, than I am because he has 4 children. So a way that we could also think about this, the concept of fitness, would be if we look at Utah as a whole has a higher number of offspring per individual than other states in the country. There is a culture here, as I'm sure everyone is aware, of having more children in an individual's life than in other states. So if we look at all of the states combined, Utah has higher fitness than other states because as a state, individuals in the state tend to have higher numbers of offspring than in other states. Okay, so the last item, selective pressures. Selective pressures are any kind of environmental factors that can affect an individual's reproductive success. So what's going on in the environment that is causing one individual to have better or worse fitness? So it could be anything. It could be availability of water. It could be availability of food. It could be any number of things, physical characteristics that the individual has, anything that's going on in the environment that is impacting an individual's reproductive success. Okay, so let's go over some preconditions for natural selection. So what conditions have to be present in order for natural selection to occur? The first here is that the trait in question must be inherited. So Darwin didn't understand genetics. They had no concept of genetics, so there was like a missing piece to his puzzle. We now understand, of course, how inheritance works with genes. So basically what we're saying here is that the trait in question has to be genetically controlled. It has to be something that's present in your genes that's going to be passed on to your offspring. It can't be, a characteristic that you acquired during your life, like a scar on your arm. That's not something that's inherited. Okay, number 2, the trait in question must show variation between individuals. Variation between individuals meaning, one individual is slightly larger than the other, has a slightly different coat than the other, has slightly, has slightly better vision. So there has to be a trait in question that all of the individuals have, and there's variation within the population for that trait. Number 3, the filter between the organism and its genetic makeup is the environment, which must exert some pressure in order for natural selection to act. So basically what this means is that there has to be some kind of environmental pressure, some kind of selective pressure that is going to be exerted for natural selection to act. So there has to be some kind of situation in an environment where some individuals are doing better than others for whatever reason. If you don't have all 3 of these preconditions met, natural selection is not going to occur. One thing that is important to remember down here at the bottom, natural selection works at the individual level. So I myself, if I was stranded on a desert island, natural selection or selective pressures would be acting on me as an individual. Evolution is a process that occurs at the population level. So evolutionary change occurs at the population level. Natural selection works at the individual level. So Darwin knew that evolution occurred, and he figured out the mechanism. The mechanism that he discovered was natural selection, but he didn't really understand the underlying processes that drove natural selection. Because again, he didn't know anything about genes. He didn't know how inheritance worked. Those were unanswered questions that it would take quite some time for the scientific community to figure out. But as I said, once Darwin laid out all of these ideas logically and presented all of the evidence that he had observed on his voyage of the Beagle, it was such a strong argument that, as I said, really hardly any of the scientific community opposed his ideas. Everyone pretty much agreed this is legitimate, this is well argued, there's plenty of evidence here in support of this idea. And ever since then, the scientific community has really embraced these ideas. And as I said, natural selection, evolution by natural selection, is referred to as a theory because it's been tested over and over and over and over since the 1850s, and nothing has ever disproven natural selection. So it's risen to the level of a theory because nobody has ever been able to disprove it. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of these examples of evidence for evolution, but one that I will go over is the peppered moth example. We'll just talk about this really quickly. So some of you have probably heard of this. It's a very famous case. England, late 19th century. Once the Industrial Revolution got up and running, the environment in parts of England changed pretty dramatically. And it drove the evolution of this particular species of moth. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, this moth had a light color. So if we look at this picture here on the slide, that's what most of the moths look like. 95% of the moth population, the peppered moth population, had this kind of light coloration. Now, they had this light coloration for the purpose of camouflaging. So these peppered moths spend most of their time on the lichen on the surface of tree trunks, which is light in color. So once these peppered moths are on the surface of the lichen, they're basically invisible to predators. So they have a really good mechanism for camouflaging themselves. Now, when the Industrial Revolution kicked up, they were burning a lot of coal to run the factories in various parts of England, and that coal burning process produced a ton of smog and pollution into the environment. And the effect was to stain that lichen surface of all of the trees. So these animals, in a very short period of time, just a few years, went from being perfectly camouflaged on clean lichen to standing out like a sore thumb on soot-stained lichen. So they're no longer camouflaged. They don't have their evolutionary advantage anymore. Now, as I said before, 95% to 97% probably of these moths have this light coloration. There is a genetic variant that allows for these moths to have a dark coloration. Now, when the environment shifted, the selective pressures shifted, and these moths that had the dark coloration were the ones that were camouflaged all of a sudden. So they started to have a fitness advantage. They started to be able to evade predators and reproduce more successfully than their lighter counterparts. So there was a shift in just a few years, a drastic shift from most of the moth population being light in color to most of the population being dark in color, because there was such a strong selective pressure because of all the soot in the environment. Now, a few decades later, after the Industrial Revolution was winding down, the environment started to get cleaned up a little bit, the soot was being taken out of the environment, and the lichen turned back to its original color. So once the soot was out of the environment, the lichen went back to being light in color. These dark moths went back to being maladaptive, and the light moths went back to being selected for. So we have a reversal here, where we have strong selective pressures leading to the moth population becoming primarily dark in color, and then we have strong selective pressures shifting in the other direction to cause these peppered moths to become lighter in color. So that's the classic example. Like I said, you've probably heard of that example in other classes. Most times I teach this class, a handful of people have heard of that example. But other things exist in nature, like other forms of camouflage. Lots of insects have camouflage morphology. A really good example of a kind of a high-tech version of camouflage would be I've completely forgotten the name of this animal. A chameleon, sorry. So a chameleon, for example, can change its own colors to become well camouflaged against whatever background they're in front of. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about with respect to Darwin is some of his later work. So Darwin published 2 books in his lifetime. The first was On the Origin of Species, and the second was The Descent of Man. The complete title is The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. So the first book, On the Origin of Species, Darwin was really just talking about natural selection. And he actually very pointedly avoided talking about humans in any way. I think he kind of realized that he was going to be in hot water enough already, and he just decided to leave humans out of the mix because he figured that the backlash would be that much more intense if he had dared to talk about human evolution at all. So about 15 years later, Darwin published his second book, which is all about human evolution. The Descent of Man covers a lot of different topics. The first half of the book, as it says here on the slide, applies evolutionary theory to human evolution. He discusses mental traits, physical traits in human society. Now, I will say that The Descent of Man really doesn't stand the test of time in the first half here. It's really It's very much a reflection of the social environment that Darwin lived in at the time as part of the elite in England. He wasn't a member of the aristocracy, but he was wealthy. He was from a wealthy family. So a lot of this is problematic to say the least. He had a lot of what we would consider today modern, very offensive things to say about human women and human sexual behavior. So the first half of the book isn't great. As I said, it hasn't stood the test of time. But the second half of the book, he gets back on track and he talks about his theory of sexual selection. So we will talk more about sexual selection in the next chapter, or I think 2 chapters from now. But I'll just go over it really briefly. His theory of sexual selection was basically looking at how populations can evolve, not as a result of selective pressures in nature, but as a result of sexual preferences between individuals. So what he's saying is that evolutionary change can occur as a result of environmental change, but it can also occur as a result of mate preference, basically. So he talks about 2 aspects of sexual selection. The first is something that he called female choosiness, and the second is direct competition between males. So female choosiness, he used that term. Nowadays, the term that's used is called intersexual selection. Intersexual meaning between the 2 sexes. Basically, what this means is that one sex is competing for members of the opposite sex, but there's choice involved. So the way that this ends up working in most species is that females will choose who they want to mate with. Now, this can result in kind of weird physical characteristics. A lot of birds especially have sex differences that are the result of female choosiness. Peacocks are the classic example. The males are the individuals that have these big fancy tail feathers. The females, as pictured here, are much more plain looking. They have a little bit of coloration on their neck, but that's about it. Turkeys, same way. The males are the ones that we think of when we think of Thanksgiving turkeys. The females are much less exciting to look at. Basically, the reason why these characteristics have evolved in the males is because they're trying to attract the attention of the females. So the females don't really have to compete for access to males. The males want to mate with them regardless of what they look like. But the males have to kind of up their game a little bit because the females are in a position of power where they can choose the males that they want to mate with. So we end up again with these kind of really elaborate looking tail feathers in birds. This is one of my favorite examples in the bottom corner, the proboscis monkey. The males end up having these really large, weird-looking noses. The females have just a normal-looking monkey nose. And for whatever reason, the females are just turned on by this big nose, and they want to preferentially mate with males that have that big nose. So over time, the nose size increases and increases because the females are preferentially mating with males that have that characteristic. So that's intersexual selection. Darwin also wrote about direct competition between males. Today, this is mostly referred to as intrasexual. So intrasexual selection is competition between members of the same sex for access to the other members of the other. So the way that this works out most of the time in nature is that two males are physically, aggressively competing with each other for access to females. So the females are kind of, their choice is taken out of the matter. They basically will be expected to mate with whoever wins the dominance competition. But we see a lot of this in nature with antelope of various kind, where the males develop these large antlers that they use for fighting with each other, so that whoever wins the physical competition gets access to the females. The lions here, two male lions don't typically reside in the same family group. Typically, sometimes it happens, but more often they will very aggressively physically compete for access to groups of females. So what happens here with intrasexual selection is that you end up with very distinct differences between male and female morphology, actually in both of these cases. So in intersexual selection, you end up with a lot of these kind of useless characteristics that are really pretty in some species and kind of weird in others, that the males have to attract females. So the females are playing an active role in choosing who they want to mate with. And then in intrasexual selection, it's all about physical domination. So the males are fighting with each other, in very kind of dangerous physical feats of strength for access to the females. So both of Darwin's ideas, natural selection and sexual selection, again, have really stood the test of time. And they both form the basis for how we understand evolution to work today. So we're done with this slide set. We'll move on to some basics about genetics. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, but we'll talk about basic genetic processes next week, and then we'll go into more modern contemporaneous views on evolutionary theory following that.